Three types of anxiety. So we have clinical anxiety, spiritual anxiety, and situational anxiety. They can all overlap, or they could stand alone. But there are distinct features of each one that help you to decide which one you're going through. So for clinical anxiety, I would explain this as a reaction that comes without a thought. So an example of this was when my youngest son was only a couple months old. I thought I was dying. I couldn't breathe, and I thought something was wrong with me. I was like 26 years old, and I'm like, oh, this is it. I'm dying, guys. Go ahead and start planning my funeral. But from sun up to sundown, I could not catch a breath, and it felt miserable. So I went to my doctor, and she said, well, we'll get you into the pulmonologist and see if there's something going on. Pulmonologist said everything looked fine, and I just let it be for a few months. Went back to the doctor, and she said, is it anxiety related maybe? I was like, no, that's silly. I'm not having a panic attack. I've had anxiety since I was 16. This is not anxiety. And she said, no, I understand, but you can have breathing issues too. Lo and behold, she was right. I wasn't anxious, but I was waking up every day struggling because of clinical anxiety. So I spent more time in prayer, spent more time in just silence and meditation, and I got through it. But that was a good example of something happening without a thought. Spiritual anxiety keeps you from God. Those of you who are well-versed in spiritual warfare will understand this one. And if you don't know, then a few weeks ago, I was praying over something very specific with this ministry. And it was a really good prayer time where I was so spirit-led in what was going on. And then about 30 minutes afterwards, I was sitting in class and racked with fear and anxiety over nothing. I couldn't tell you what it was, but I literally could not speak because it was so heavy. So I texted one of my friends, and I'm like, hey, I need you to start praying over this immediately. I can't. And so then eventually I get out to my car and I pray it off. But that spirit was meant to keep me down. So spiritual anxiety. And then we have situational anxiety, which is what we'll be focusing on tonight. Situational anxiety is your fleeting worries or fears over specific situations. And this could be like, what if I don't get that job? What if those people don't like me? What if this terrible situation doesn't get worse or doesn't get better? In any of these, I would suggest consulting the prayer team because they're phenomenal, and they will help you walk through this and help you sort it out. But in most messages like these, you'll hear the verse Philippians 4, verse 6. I'm going to get this eventually, guys. Anyways, which says, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. It's a great verse. I love it, and it's actually one of my go-tos. But I'm going to be honest with you guys. If you can't trust God, you can't lean on this verse. If you don't know that God hears your prayers, this verse does you no good. So, the good news in this, though, is that we're not alone in this struggle of feeling like we can't trust God's word. I'm sure most of us in here have struggled with it. And I could go on for hours about the people in the Bible who have struggled with it. And just to start, Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, was so afraid of what would happen, even though he knew Jesus had told him what was going to happen, but he was so afraid of what would happen if people knew who he was. He denied Jesus 3 times. The Israelites, God's chosen people, they got everything from God. They saw miracles that we could never fathom, and they were always worried. They were always worried about what was going to happen next. They were freed out of slavery, and then they blamed Moses for taking them out to the desert to die. God was literally sending food down from the heavens, and they were afraid they were going to starve. And then Moses was gone for too long. They made a calf to worship because they didn't know what was going to happen. They were so afraid that they kept going to other things. And these people saw God in such miraculous ways. They were, again, his chosen people. But they still worried, and they still struggled to trust him. But the beautiful thing about this is that God never stopped giving them chances to trust him. He let them deal with their consequences from time to time. If any of y'all have kids, you understand this. I'm only going to tell you 17 times that you're going to get your fingers pinched in the door before I let you. Just a disclaimer, I would never do that to my children. For those of you who know my children, you know better. Anyways, so here's where we start with Judges 6. I will paraphrase the first bit for you. So in Judges, the Israelites are dealing with their consequences. God had very strict rules for them. They didn't follow the rules. And so now they're under the rule of the Midianites. And the Midianites are terrible. They are burning their crops. They're slaughtering their livestock. The Israelites have no food. They have no safety. And it's because they kept on making their own consequences. But God loves his people. So he had pity on them. And he decided to bring from within them a great warrior. So we see an angel gets sent to a young man named Gideon. So an angel introduces himself, and immediately Gideon responds by saying, "Pardon me, my Lord, but if the Lord was with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hands of Midian." See, God is patient with Gideon, though. Gideon's angry. Gideon's confused. But God's patient. And so instead of being like, "All right, get your crap together," he's like, "Okay, hold on. We'll fill this out." So in verse 14, whatever verse this is, I'm sorry, guys, 14. The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" Going to be really honest, this is kind of funny because Gideon has no idea who he's speaking to. So he's probably like, who is this random dude empowering me to go take down these people? So that's the whole thing. So Gideon in verse 15, am I on track? Yes, okay. Says, "But how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." This story is one of my absolute favorites because of this verse. God comes to Gideon, asks him to do something terrifying, and the first thing Gideon says is, "I'm too weak." But don't we all do that? Don't we all evaluate our own abilities, our own strengths? We don't consider who is calling us to do these things. And instead, we let that worry come out first. So, Gideon's probably thinking, God's got the wrong guy. Listen, I'll be honest, I've thought that a few times. There's no way God would call me to do anything after the crap I've done. But that's a whole other story. Thankful for the grace of Jesus, right? So, how can someone so weak do something so great? It kind of sounds like one of those anxious questions. But how can he? How can the weakest of the weak save his people? Well, in verse 16, the angel of the Lord responds and says, I will be with you. It's another one of those we can't, God can moments. Without God, Gideon can't do anything. But God never planned to let Gideon fight this battle alone anyways. So we could end here, but we won't, because now Gideon understands that this man is God. After this verse, I'm not going to read everything to you, but he now knows that this is God. So God asks him to tear down this altar to Baal, which is actually on Gideon's father's property. And he wants Gideon to replace it with an altar to God. Gideon was still afraid, though. He did it, but he did it under nightfall so no one would see him. So he followed through with fear. And then the people the next day decided they wanted Gideon executed. But God saved him from that. And Gideon is still worried about freeing the Israelites at this point. So he asked God for a sign. Gideon said to God, this is verse 36, Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said. And that is what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowl full of water. This is a phenomenal sign. I mean, I don't know about you, but I'd be pretty dang impressed. I'm sure Gideon was too. I'm not saying he wasn't. Gideon was a great man of God. But this still isn't enough for Gideon to be sold. So he goes to God for another sign. And he says in verse 39, then Gideon said to God, do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let only the ground be covered with dew. That night God did so. Only the fleece was dry, all the ground was covered with dew. So at this point, Gideon can finally trust God. He's not worried anymore, and if I had time to go into Judges 7, y'all be like, holy cow, okay. Anyways, but he's no longer afraid because he knows that God is with him. He knows that this is God's will. He didn't realize that he was going to lead an army of only 300 people, but he trusts God even through that. There's like 25,000 soldiers that show up to fight for the Israelites. And God tells them to send everyone home except for these 300 they selected. And the Midianite army was like 125,000 soldiers. But that's all beside the point. The point is that Gideon was victorious because he allowed God to do his work. He let go of his own worry and allowed God to work. So, my question for you is, how much does God have to do to prove that he is worthy of your trust? So, look back on your life and find those places where he's shown up when everything seemed impossible. And I'll tell you right now, for most of you, I can tell you one, it's that you're here today. How many of us should be dead because of our addictions, right? A lot. How many of us should be in jail or should have been in jail longer? Yeah. God brought us through that. So, Look back on your addiction, on all those times, your hurt, habit, or hang up you tried to quit on your own accord. How'd that work out for you? How hard was that? And I'm not going to say that this road is easy, but it's a whole heck of a lot easier knowing that you have an almighty Father who loves you that will walk through this with you. And if you've come to the other side of your hurt, habit, or hang up, that's the impossible turned possible right there. I go to a secular college, and y'all would not believe if any of y'all have ever done research on it, you wouldn't believe the amount of people that are in here right now that should be impossible according to scientific studies. So, if God's done the impossible for you already, why would it not be possible for him to reunite your family? Why would it not be possible for him to give you that job you need or to fix your situation at your job? Why could he not give you a community that's godly and there for you? You've seen him do the impossible. Lean into that. Know that truth. But when you can't, ask him for help. If y'all have heard me speak, you're probably going to hear this verse every time I come up here. I'm sorry. But every time I struggle to remember how good God is, I always go back to the story in Mark 9. And the story is that there is a man whose son needs healing. And he brings him to Jesus. And Jesus says, well, I can fix him. Anything's possible through God. But the man isn't fully convinced. And so he says to Jesus in verse 24, he says, I do believe. Help me to overcome my unbelief. I literally pray that verse to God when I'm struggling, when I know there's something in me that can't grasp his almighty power. And I don't want you to leave here tonight and question everything that God does. But rest assured that when you do need him, God will help you. He may not answer you in the way that you expect. I mean, I'm sure Gideon never would have fathomed God would say, okay, take 300 dudes and go wipe out this giant army. Have fun. But he answered him, right? That's because God knows what's best. He knows what's best for us. He knows what's best for his overall plan. So the next time you're feeling anxious, I want you to remember this acronym. So we're just going to remember Gideon, okay? The G stands for give yourself grace. Recognize that anxiety you're feeling and be okay with having it for a moment. Give yourself that grace. Don't beat yourself up. And then I stands for identify what type of anxiety you're having. Figure out if it is clinical, if it is spiritual, if it's just this situation. Then devote time to God. Sit in his presence. Stay there a while. Be comfortable with him. Earnestly give your feelings to God and then receive what he has to say. So that one's two-part. Don't forget that one. Let him speak to your heart the way that he knows how. And then occupy your mind with truth. Think back to all those times that the impossible should have never been made possible in your life. And then neutralize the negative feelings with the word of God. Look back on what his word says about you, says about his people, says about his power. And I also want to give you my personal favorite verses to lean on in troubled times. 2 Timothy 1 verse 7 says, for the Spirit God gave us does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline. Isaiah 40, verse 31 says, "But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint." Isaiah 41, verse 10 says, "So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." In Hebrews 11, verse 1 says, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see." And then my favorite one isn't going to fit on here. So my favorite one to go to is Matthew 26, verse 25 through 34. If I try to read it up here, nobody in this room is going to be happy because it's going to take forever and I'm going to stumble through 90% of it. But find those verses that speak to you. Find those verses that draw you closer to God to get through the situation. And again, you can always go to our prayer team. They're fantastic, and they really do enjoy what they do. They do it because they feel called to, and they want to be here to help each one of you. But also, when you go through those situations, we're your family, we're your community. Come to somebody here, come to your sponsor, your mentor, your group leader, your group members. If you're not in a group, get in a group. I'm not going to go on Corey's tangent, but get in a group. Make those connections. Have that closer community.